Greetings and welcome once again to the Harris Library Studio. Behind me is the library at Windsor Castle. That's my library for the day that I'm enjoying as my backdrop. Sorry if you're getting a little bit of static there. Hopefully I've rectified that. Today we're going to be looking at the beginnings of the golden age of German philosophers. There are going to be several German philosophers that we're going to look at. We're going to look at a couple of them in this video, and then to break it up into shorter chunks, I've done a separate one that's going to deal more with Hegel and with Heidegger. Welcome to the Germans. There are going to be lots of German philosophers, and it's a little bit difficult because some of them are going to be from places that eventually aren't part of Germany. For instance, Joseph Schumpeter is technically going to be Austrian, but he falls in, that's his country of origin, but he still speaks German, and he's going to have a lot in common with some of the other German philosophers, as we'll see. The father of them, and kind of the beginning of the German golden age, is Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant is going to be an interesting fellow because he's going to be like Beethoven, who straddles the classical to the romantic periods of music and is somewhat part of neither. We see the same thing with Kant. Kant is going to start out in the 1720s is when he's born. And so he's very much part of the Enlightenment age, the 18th century of Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau, although Rousseau is not actually going to be really an Enlightenment philosopher. He's much more romantic. And so is true for Kant. Kant is going to be closer to the Romantics than he is going to be to the Enlightenment philosophers, but he's going to have some pieces with both of them. As I mentioned, this begins the golden age of German philosophy. A lot of his ideas are going to be in line with what we see as the reaction to the Enlightenment. And the reaction to the Enlightenment is going to include the Romantics, who are going to reject the idea that the head is all that there is, that there is more to man and more to how we make decisions and understand the world than simply, there's a lot more in terms of heart as well. And so that man is not simply a rational creature. Most of the time we're very irrational. Now, in addition to that, Kant is also going to be looking, though, he's going to be operating in the context, in the milieu of the Enlightenment. So he's going to synthesize some of the rationalism and the emphasis on reason that you get in the Enlightenment with some of the empiricism that's more practically kind of based and less theoretical, and some of the ideas of the Romanticism. So it's kind of a fusion of a lot of different things. He argues that human autonomy and understanding was the foundation of science and religious belief, the idea that the human brain operated independently. And this concept of what it means to be human and what makes the thinker think is going to be something that we see a lot in the construction of the German philosophers. We'll see this to a degree in Herder and Hegel, but we will certainly see it in Heidegger's work that leads into the existentialism. He's going to believe that there's not this grand distinction between science and religion and morality that some of the philosophers wanted to argue. Nietzsche, for instance, is going to argue for a morality that has nothing to do with religion in some of his works. And so we see a lot of that here, where he's going to say, no, there's not nearly as many conflicting pieces as you think there are. And so we'll see that discussion here. He thinks that practicality is superior than to speculative reason. He's not really interested in this whole business of let's speculate how many angels can stand on the head of a pin, which is kind of the classic theological thing. But he's also not interested in all of your philosophical ramblings about who man is and things. In fact, he'd probably be very impatient with some of the things that are going to be written by guys like Heidegger much later on. Now, he actually wrote several different works. He has a critique of pure reason and a critique of practical reason. In other words, all of this he sees as needing a criticism, that none of it's complete. Right? You need all of these. And he talks about the power of judgment. And then he's going to write about metaphysics and morals and things of this nature. He sees that he really wants to kind of unify this business of theoretical and practical parts of philosophy. And so he's trying to find a way between the theoretical pieces of Plato and the Enlightenment philosophers and the practicality portions of Aristotle and even the practical portions of Plato. He wants to fuse all of that together. So let's go see what he has to say. And I'm going to move myself down again. Kant's political philosophy surrounds the idea of the Reichsstaat, the legal state. Now, Reich, and sometimes spelled with an I, is going to often just refer to not just so much to empire, but to the state. So the Reichstag is the assembly of the Reich, the assembly of the state, the assembly of the empire, if you will. Now, I'm not going into all of Kant's ideas, okay? Because we're supposed to be dealing with political philosophy, and if I try to do all of Kant, we'll never get out. And his doctrine of the Reichstag, his legal state doctrine, is very fascinating and is very applicable to those of you who are going into policy or even into law. Because what he's going to talk about is this concept of the legal state, or we might say the constitutional state, or talk about the Constitution. And what he means is that authority and power of the state are limited. Now, he's not going back and discussing social contract, though some of the concepts of social contract are kind of underlying some of what he says, but that's not the focus of what he's talking about. He's talking about the limitations of government, that the power of the state is limited and the citizens should be protected from arbitrary force. Now, this is something coming out of the 18th century where he's very much aware of the level of force that the state is capable of. He sees that firsthand. You can see that certainly with the French Revolution, which he lives through as an outside observer. He's not going to be French, though. But also the German principalities were not known for their light-handedness. So he's aware of the kind of force that a state can have. So he sees that the authority and the power of the state does have a limit. And the citizens have to be protected from these kinds of arbitrary violence and being forced to do certain things. Now, how that limitation works out is another bit of a question. A lot of what he's talking about here is the rule of law, which is what the Anglo-American tradition refers to it as. In other words, everybody's subject to the same limits. The president is subject to the same laws as the people, and this is something that we constantly argue about. He's going to talk a lot about civil liberties and the necessity of people having access to the court system. And he says without these kinds of boundaries, no state is really all that legitimate. If they don't have some boundaries, which is in some ways very much a reflection on what he sees coming out of the French Revolution. Now, his ideas about the Reichstag are going to be after Burke, so he's going to be inheritor of that to a degree. But you've got to have some boundaries. If you don't have any boundaries, then you're just dictatorial, and that's not a legitimate state. You have to have legitimate boundaries. Now, he does not believe you can be a liberal democracy without a constitution. Now, Kant doesn't really deal with the English model, which is pretty bizarre, quite frankly, and has a constitution, but it's evolved over 900 years, so it's kind of difficult to deal with. He opposes, though, direct democracy. The model that you're getting in the Swiss Republic by this point, in the Swiss cantons, is very much a much more direct thing. He sees it as dangerous and a threat to personal individual freedom because the ideas of the mob can kind of overtake it, which is an echo of what we heard in Aristotle, and is an echo of very much the kind of classical Republican theory that direct democracy is dangerous and it doesn't have any limits on the ideas of the mob. And populism is not necessarily going to always yield you a common weal where we're dealing with the good of all. And that's something he's concerned with, and something many others are as well. Now, as I mentioned, Kant is going to begin this kind of golden age of philosophers. It really begins with Hegel, and I kind of want to walk through a few of these philosophers, some of whom we'll spend more time with than others. Um, uh, Johann Fichte, or Gottlieb Fichte, he's going to deal a lot with idealism and nationalism. Nationalism is going to be a very potent idea in in the Germanic principalities, which are not yet Germany until 1871. He writes his addresses to the German nation in 1808, and once again trying to stir up the Germans to unify. And he believes that the Germans are supposed to lead humanity into this new great age. If you want to, and you're taking notes, you can probably put a star by this idea because it's something that shows up in a lot of German philosophers. Um, we see this concept. Now, Fichte is nowhere near going to be anywhere close to what we get with Heidegger or Hitler or any, and yes, they all seem to say and start with either F, G, or H. I don't know what the deal is. The reality is though this nationalism is incredibly potent in areas that didn't have already a state. For Italy, for in fact several folks who are within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and certainly for the various German principalities. And so he sees this as a key thing. Now, Fichte was actually a student of Kant, as is Schelling, who I'll talk about in a moment. And he's going to actually, though, be very clear that in his political ideology, he's not talking about unified, a kind of unified citizenship, a universal citizenship, a universal suffrage. He means he sees women as very much inferior. If he's dealing with the women question, he's going to see women as not applicable as citizens. Very much kind of what we see in some ways with Aristotle. But he's also going to add in a lovely other little things very, very popular in German and French philosophers of this age, and that's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as we discussed in class, is going to be kind of rampant in Europe in the 19th century. And it doesn't get much better in the 20th for a long time. And anti-Semitism is very, very prevalent in his writings. Now, Friedrich Schelling is also a student of Kant, and Schelling as going to be a roommate at university with Hegel, whom later on they're going to be rivals, but they start out as college roommates. Schelling is trickier for us because a lot of his stuff has not been translated into English, and German words are different from English. When we're dealing with Germans, the Germans smush words together in ways that changes the meaning of the overall thing. They have, they have words for things that we take several words to describe. One of my favorite memes of the moment is the German word that means grief eating of bacon or grief eating of potatoes. And it's like, oh, well, we know what that is. But they have a word for that. And somewhere in our library, Damon actually my husband has a book that's all of the kind of smushed up words that the Germans use. And so some things don't always translate particularly well out of the German. It's the same thing we see with the Greek, that you're going to need about 5 words to try and figure out what the Germans or the Greeks are saying with one. Now, of course, I've mentioned the Germans and the Greeks, and in an ode to Dr. Bazile, I have to encourage you to watch the video that I'm going to put up, which is a Germans versus the Greeks, a soccer match. It's a Monty Python sketch, and it's the philosophers fighting, having a soccer match with one another. And it's kind of a funny sort of piece. But Schelling's work is untranslated, and that makes some things interesting in trying to decipher what he meant in English. he's going to talk about the idea, this concept that you can't just have these ideals up here, that the ideal has to come from somewhere. It has to come from something that's already a real thing. Otherwise, what are you doing? It's not, in fact, going to be something that's just an idea first. It has to spring from something that's already real. He says that mythology, revelation, um, all have their roots in reality, in physical reality. And he doesn't see that the opposition of positive and negative as something that is fast and firm. Now, the other guys that we're going to talk about, and I'm not going to go deep into Schelling, is going to be. I sent a picture of James. Thank you, baby. James is back, by the way. We'll see Johann von Herder and his ideas on nationalism. We're going to talk a little bit about in just a few minutes, as well as Hegel. George William Friedrich Hegel is going to be a key fellow in some of how the German philosophers begin to understand things. And of course, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is well after this kind of golden age that ends really with Hegel's death in the 1830s. But he's certainly heir to it, and he's going to use parts of it in his own ideas. Heidegger has a lot of baggage with him, not the least of which is that he joins the Nazi Party in 1933, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to him. But he is going to have to be in our kind of list of German philosophers. I'll add another here, and that's Joseph Schumpeter, whom we'll talk more about when we look at imperialism. But Schumpeter is also going to write on democracy as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about him as well. Now, one of the key features when you're talking about the German philosophers is that we see a return to the dialectic. This model that we saw with Socrates and with Plato, we see here, and used kind of differently. The dialectic is going to be transformed and kind of transposed by Hegel into a new form. Now, the dialectic is going to argue that all things change. Actually, before we go in further in the dialectic, I wanted to go ahead and stop and give you Schumpeter. Schumpeter is not always put with the golden age of German philosophy because he is, in fact, Austrian, as I mentioned. But Schumpeter is also not put there because he does a lot of his work while he's in the United States. But Schumpeter is also not just a philosopher, he's an economist. And that's going to actually weigh into a lot of his ideas. We'll talk a little bit more about him in the next video when I address Heidegger. But I'll go ahead and give you his premier work, which is written in 1942. But he also writes a work that counters Lenin's ideas in 1919. Lenin writes on imperialism in 1916. So we're going to hear from Schumpeter in a couple of different contexts. He's going to write about empire. He's going to write about economics. He's going to oppose Marx. He's going to very much oppose the Nazis' ideology in a way that Heidegger really doesn't. And he's going to see a lot more worth in democracy than some of the others are, but for rather different reasons, as we're going to see. What he sees in the worth of democracy is a different thing. And it's something that's actually critical to our understandings of democracy in the 21st century. So we're going to look a little bit at Schumpeter. I like him for lots of different reasons. Now, I left off a second ago about the dialectic. Now, the dialectic is going to be old, but it's going to actually change a little bit, and the Germans are all going to kind of fall in love with it. It's this ancient construct to find truth. And something that certainly Plato uses, something Socrates uses, but it's going to begin to be used in different ways by the various German philosophers. Kant, Fichte, and Schelling all use it for different concepts, and Marx will later on. We also are going to see Hegel do some different things with it. So what is this? Well, And by the way, if you haven't gotten it yet, go ahead and get out your handout that is Marx's use of the dialectic. It's when you print it off, it's going to say Marx's theory of history, but that's the one that you need. Okay. And the idea here is that there is a thesis and an antithesis, or an antithesis, if you want to say it that way so it's more clear. In other words, your thesis and its opposite, and that you must argue between them. And in the argument between them, you somehow get to synthesis, where the truth actually should lie. Now, Marx is going to use this in a very, very different fashion, as we'll see. But this is the specific method that you see showing up. Hegel uses this sort of. But the structure is even older than Socrates. It actually belongs to Heraclitus, who uses this to a degree. But when we start to see this concept used here by Hegel, one of the things that we start to see is this idea of the abstract arguing with the negative. That these two things that are polar opposites, but one is more abstract, one is its negative. And then between the argument, you get to the concrete. This is what's actually real. This is what's necessary. And this is what you need to understand. This is sometimes called the Aufbung. This is the synthesis that's achieved by preserving the useful portion of the negative along with this abstract thought. In other words, think of it as if you are writing a paper, that you have a thesis that you're arguing, but you know that there are things out there that are actually not really in line with what part of your argument is, that seem to contradict it. If you can legitimately incorporate some of those things that are contrary or criticisms of your argument into the whole of your paper, to say, no, yes, this looks like this is a negative, but this is how that negative informs my concept and informs what's going on here. When you incorporate those two together into something that's more concrete, say the argument in your paper, then you've achieved that synthesis. And this is the kind of way in which we see Hegel and some of the other German philosophers use this. Marx is going to use it in a rather different fashion, which is what I want to turn to for a moment. Because Marx is going to use the dialectic in the Communist Manifesto to talk about materialism, okay? Because he thinks that things change in a particular way. And the dialectic actually kind of explained how change took place, or changes of ideas, at least in the way he's going to use it. But he's going to use it to say that change is actually all about material, okay? And the lecture on fascism, I talk about how the fascists actually reject Marx because he says everything is about material, about who has something and who doesn't have something, that's all that matters, because he believes economics is all that matters, which is one of the things that makes Schumpeter interesting, because Schumpeter completely disagrees with him, even though he's an economist. Economics matters, but economics is not all that matters, okay? Now, as part of his discussion in the Communist Manifesto, yes, my husband just brought me a shake. I am thirsty, and I'm not going to disdain my shake at the moment. Okay. The stages of history are going to be how he believes history works itself out. Now, regardless of what you think about Marx doesn't really care, because Marx thinks this is the key. He's found the key to how history works itself out, and this is it, okay? Now, part of this is the theory of increasing misery. He believes that the working class is going to get more and more miserable. There's never going to be any relief. Democracy is useless. It can't affect any sort of change against the capitalist bourgeoisie, and therefore you're going to have worldwide revolution. He also doesn't believe nationalism is important, which is really interesting for a guy who's a German philosopher who's heard all of these Germans who are going to talk so much about nationalism. So what does he do? He uses the thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure. And if you've got your handout, there's some boxes for these various things on there. But he puts them in very different things because the dialectic is not about the ideas, it's about the stuff. Okay. It's about the stuff that you have. On one side, you've got the haves, on the other, you've got the have-nots. And the people who have the stuff and the people who don't have the stuff, who are constantly arguing over the stuff and whoever has the stuff. And eventually their argument will produce a new haves class that will then argue with the new have-nots class. Now, he goes through various stages of history and talks about different ones. He says there was a kind of proto-communism early on in history, and then you go to the slave society. And the slave society he really talks about is primarily Rome, and he has patricians over here and the plebeians over here. And I think I've left out an E again on plebeians, but that's not all that altogether unusual. And that these two groups will argue with one another and are going to be displaced. Now, he has a couple of issues here with his understanding of Roman history. Now, one of his problems with Rome is that he kind of oversimplifies their class system. There's not just patricians and plebeians. There's lots of different pieces. And quite frankly, the plebeians are not the have-not class. If you want the have-not class, you're going to have to go deal with the slaves. And there are people below the plebeians. The plebeians are actually citizens of Rome. So it doesn't quite work out as nice and neat as he wants it to. And he's actually going to use a term proletarian or proletariat from ancient Rome later on. But his theory is that the patricians and the plebeians argue enough with one another, and then you have this displacement, and the new lords class of the feudal age will be created from the fusion of these two, the have class and the have-nots. Don't know that that's actually true. He kind of doesn't factor in the Germans there who are invading things much, but that's what his theory is. And because he thinks only the stuff this matters, he doesn't think religion or any other ideology matters either. Okay. He says the next class is the lords and the serfs, and are the peasants. Now, Marx doesn't like peasants. He thinks they're stupid. Okay. And that we can't have revolution with just peasants, which is why Mao Zedong is going to have to really change his theory before he can actually make it applicable to China. And Lenin's going to face some similar issues, is that he's going to have to change the theory because it doesn't work out quite the way Marx thinks it's going to for Russia. The lords and the serfs argue with one another until we get to the bourgeoisie. Now, he's conveniently skimming over the rise of towns and a host of other things and a middle class and lots of other stuff. And he says the new class is going to be the bourgeoisie. Now, here's where his biggest problem is that the lords didn't go away. You may now have a new new class, but you haven't gotten rid of them. But he sees the bourgeoisie not as a middle class, but as the owners of the means of production. And they, of course, argue with the workers, the proletariat. Now, he's completely forgotten that you still got an aristocratic class that may or may not own all the means of production, but he's not interested in that. And he says that these two are going to argue back and forth, and here's where his theory changes. Instead of the continuing on, he says you're going to now get an inevitable world revolution, a world revolution by all of the working classes that's going to overthrow all the governments and create this workers' utopia, okay? But before you get to the utopia, we have to have a dictatorship for a time of the proletariat where they can get rid of everything like private property, which he sees as the ultimate evil, so that everybody learns to share and accept that the only value in something is the value it took to make it. That labor is all there is, and there is no surplus value to anything, i.e. profit. And after that, after the dictatorship of the proletariat, which shouldn't take too long for people to get used to this, we'll get rid of all gender barriers, the family, all religion, in favor of this new workers' utopia, which will obviously come into being very quickly. Um, every time this is tried, it gets stuck in the dictatorship of the proletariat, but don't tell Marx. Now, for now, I'm going to leave you here with the dialectic, and I'm going to shift to a new video. And in the new one, we will take a look at more on Hegel and Heidegger and Schumpeter, and talk about those. And I'll see you in a little bit. Thank you.